Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the monthly economic briefing presented by the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm External Affairs Assistant Director Rob Knapp, and it's great to have you with us this morning for the first briefing of 2025. Hope the new year is going well for all of you. So it looks like jobs closed on a fairly high note in December. We're going to have our chief economist, Gerald Cohen, to talk about that in a few minutes. He's also going to continue what's become sort of a tradition for us here for the first briefing of the year, a look at the trends coming up, business and economics this year. He will talk about those, and we're also going to point you toward a piece he's written that's on our website. I'll do that a little later. We'll dive in right away. Let's get started with rules of the road, which I'm giving you now, and then we'll go straight into Dr. Cohen's presentation. That will take about 15 to 20 minutes of our time. Then we're going to open it up for questions. You can ask your question at any time during the briefing by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're a member of the media, please include in your question the organization you're with so that we can prioritize those questions. If you're with us by phone today, you can ask a question as well. You can email it to me at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. I'll keep an eye out for those. We plan to do this for about 30 minutes. We sometimes run over a minute or two. If we have a lot of questions, we'll try to get to as many as we can. So that's your intro for this morning. We're going to get right into it. Like I said, joining us this morning to talk about the jobs numbers as well as some trends coming up this year is our chief economist, Gerald Cohen. Gerald, good morning and Happy New Year.
Good morning, Rob. Happy New Year to you. My video seems to not be starting. Okay, there we go.
Hi, CM. Good morning.
Good morning. Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to our audience. I think we both decided to wear some Carolina blue this morning. So I'm going to start to share my screen. Hopefully that will go as easily as it should, and then open the presentation. And let's go from there. Perfect. Now. So I'm going to talk a bit about the jobs numbers. Headline is strong, not much negativity out there. But before I do, as I would do with my students, I just want to kind of review the 5 trends, and we're going to get into each of these in a bit more detail in the second half or second 2/3 of the of the presentation. So the kind of 5 trends that we think are really important are: how will federal policies impact the economy? Think about immigration policy, tariffs, tax cuts, regulatory policy. How the Fed will respond, and we've already seen a bit of that in terms of some of their actions or their discussion in December. Will productivity save the day? Because that's an important aspect of economic growth, as I often talk about. But if Scott Bessent wants to get his 3-3-3 economy, which is a 3% growth, 3% budget deficit, and 3 million barrels of oil, at least for 1 and 2, the 3% growth and 3% budget deficit, productivity would really could really allow that, or would be a key driver of that. Do local economies differ? I want to talk a bit about our American Growth Project, and we just are about to release our 2025 numbers. And so you'll get a preview of that. And why is skills development so important? Because we're, over the next year, going to be spending a lot of time at the Kenan Institute studying skills and skills gaps, and how important they are for economic activity, and thinking about issues about measurement, and then how we can build skills. So let me just start with the employment report. As I mentioned, quite strong, 156,000 versus 165,000 that were expected. there were some small downward revisions, but they were really small. And given how much stronger the payroll number was than expected, those revisions are basically offset, more than offset. The only weak spot I could point to really is in manufacturing. Everything else, including temp help, one of my favorite indicators, was up. Hourly earnings continue to grow at quite a healthy pace. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Hours were unchanged. The unemployment rate ticked down. Again, a good sign. And the participation rate was unchanged. And so we'll get into a little bit more detail about that. So as I mentioned, payrolls were up 256,000. The orange line is the 3-month trend, and given the impact of Hurricane Helene, and we're still feeling that impact in North Carolina, we saw that big drop in October, but then you saw a bounce back in November and potentially, I think, continued bounce back in December. And so I would look at that 3-month trend, the orange line, which is running at 170,000. And that is relative to demographic factors, and I'll talk a bit about that shortly as part of the 5 trends, is stronger than demographic factors. So, we're continuing, if we continue at this pace, and without, given current demographics and, without immigration, we'd be running out of workers, and the unemployment rate would continue to tick down. And then that could lead to an inflationary spiral. So I just want to say that this is a very strong report, very strong trend, and again, lots of wiggles and waggles, and especially given the hurricane. And so that 170,000 kind of detrends the data a bit because we're getting some of the reversal from the hurricane, but that is stronger than demographic factors. So something's going to have to break. Either job creation is going to have to slow, or we're going to have to continue to pull in workers. The unemployment rate ticked down, as I mentioned, to 4.1%. My former colleague, Claudia Sahm, has created a rule called the Sahm rule, where if the unemployment rate moves above the average of the last 12 months or the low of the last 12 months by 0.5 percentage point, that indicates a recession. We actually, and you can see that kind of recession trigger line as the dark, the straight dark line, which is 0.5 percentage point. We actually triggered that number a few months ago. And then we actually have gone down, have untriggered it over the last several months. And we've never seen that before. So perhaps, as we've seen in a lot of indicators, and happy to talk about my favorite, the yield curve. I'm not sure that that's going to be wrong, but we've seen a lot of indicators that have been befuddled by the recent period and kind of potentially what's going on in COVID. So the headline on this one is that we're under the trigger point again, and usually you don't see that where you trigger it and then it reverses. Usually you trigger it and it keeps going. I mentioned this kind of the labor force participation as a key driver of whether we can continue to have workers come into the labor force. And there's two stories going on. One is prime age, or kind of workers who are 25 to 54. That's officially known as prime. I guess I'm no longer in the prime age. But these are the people most likely to work. So that number, that participation rate was unchanged in the month, but as you can see in the orange line, is above historical levels, kind of around near record levels, and so that has continued to be quite strong. But it's being offset by demographic factors. The fact is that we have more and more people who are above the prime age, including myself. And the willingness to work, or participation rate of people above 55 is much lower, and it's not gotten back to pre-COVID peaks. And so that's why the participation rate overall is below pre-COVID peaks. And then even if we continue, even if you see some rise in the participation rate of 55 and over, the demographics will kind of continue to force that at least to be flat or down. So it's hard, given our demographics, it's hard to get new kind of young workers in there because they're just a smaller share of the population. Another thing to point out is wage growth, which was up 0.3%, growing 3.9% year on year, the blue line, and that is above inflation. And so one question is, can we continue to have wage growth above inflation? And there are two things that can allow you to do that without causing an inflationary spiral. One is that profit margins will narrow, which there's not a lot of evidence of that happening. And the other is if we have strong productivity growth, which in recent periods we've had, and that's a key trend that I mentioned. Now, going to our 5 trends, I kind of wanted to talk, and kind of this discussion of demographics is exactly apt. One of the 5 trends is how will federal policies affect the economy? And as I mentioned, 2 key ones, tariffs and immigration. And so let me start by talking a bit about immigration. So there are 2 key ingredients to economic growth: job creation and productivity. And in order to get job creation, you need people working either more hours, which doesn't really happen these days anymore. I mean, hours will wiggle and waggle around, but hours have been on a flat to downtrend downtrend in the long span of history, flat over the last 20 plus years. So it's not like you're going to get people to work that many more hours. So really count on more people working. And so this chart illustrates that the potential labor force growth in the economy, this comes from the Congressional Budget Office, and you can see that in the 2010s, we've been on this downward trend, and in the 2010s, we were growing at around 0.5 percentage point growth. And so without productivity, the economy effectively would be able to grow 0.5 percentage point. And then in the last few years, we've seen a significant tick up, and that's because of immigration. Now, these numbers include immigration. Without immigration, we'd actually have even weaker numbers because demographics of native-born population were just not growing that quickly. But we've seen this big pickup because of immigration. Now, the Congressional Budget Office estimates the labor force would grow 1% in 2025, but that is based on current policies, that exist right now. A big question is whether those are going to remain in force, and the Trump administration has talked about much more stringent immigration policies and potentially deportations. And if that happens, then this increase in the labor force would likely go away. And in fact, a recent study by Brookings indicates that you could lose 100,000 workers per month, or 1.2 million of the 2.3 million jobs that were created last year. So we could effectively lose half of the job creation we had last year, given very stringent labor force, very stringent immigration policies. So if you get that, you're going to lose one of the key pillars of economic growth, which is job creation. So that's a very important trend for growth. A second trend, and a second part of that is policies around tariffs. And I just want to show you the long history of tariffs in this chart. So we are currently tariffs around 2% of imports. That's the effective tariff rate. Where the Trump administration is talking about 10%, 15%, 20% tariffs, kind of, and you'll see the last time we were there was during the Great Depression. To me, and you could say you see the increase that as a result of Smoot-Hawley from 10% to 15%. And by the way, at that point, during this period, imports were 3% of the U.S. economy. Today, they're 14%. So you can imagine that a big increase in tariffs would do two things. One is it would raise inflation because 14% of the goods and services that we purchase come from imports. And the other is that you would lower demand. And by the way, when tariffs went from 10 to 15%, imports went from 5% of the economy to 3% of the economy. So you saw the impact of those big increases in tariffs. So they effectively halved. Now we're talking about a much larger increase in the rate, and a much bigger impact, current impact on the economy. So second trend is how the Fed will react. And, the problem is that the Fed is still fighting the inflation of the past. And so the Fed is trying to get inflation. This measure in orange is the PCE price index, which is their measure that they follow. Just has been very close to their target of 2%. But as you can see in the chart, it kind of bounced back up to 2.4%. And if you look at the dynamics of core inflation, excluding volatile food and energy, it's running at 2.8%. And so the dynamics look like the Fed is having a hard time reaching its target, which is something we've talked a lot about before. And then you have the risk of tariffs. And so the Fed, in their minutes, which they released on Wednesday, talked about this and said, we're a little worried that policies are going to raise inflationary pressures. And so that's a big concern. And so they've already said we are less likely to cut rates. They took a 0.5 percentage point off of their rate cut cycle for this year. So they were expected to cut rates by a full percentage point, or they said they were going to cut rates or expected to cut rates by a full percentage point. Now they're saying we expect to cut rates by 0.5 percentage point. And so the markets have followed suit on that. And so a question is, how much of that is because of tariffs? How much of that is because of immigration policy? And the key with immigration policy is that a large number of construction workers come from immigration. There's very good evidence that the impact of deportations has a negative impact on construction. And housing prices has been one of the key drivers of inflation. And they are still running well above or at least well above the trends of the pre-COVID period. So home prices are running close to 5%, or home price inflation is running close to 5%. It was less than 3% in the pre-COVID period. And if you get deportations, or you kind of lose that growth in construction workers, that is I don't want to say likely, that will cause higher construction prices and will likely lead to higher home price inflation. So that's a big concern of the Fed. One thing that we are telling people to watch is, and the Fed is going to be watching, are these inflation expectations. The orange line comes from the University of Michigan. They survey individuals, consumers, and the other one is from market-based expectations from the financial markets, the bond market. You can kind of back out what the markets are saying inflation is based on TIPS or inflation-adjusted treasuries and nominal or regular treasury bonds. You can back that out. These are both longer-term measures, and the question is, are they going to pick up? And if so, that will really give the Fed the heebie-jeebies. As I mentioned, and I'm going to be very quick about these. Productivity can be a magic elixir in solving a lot of these problems. When we tend to have high productivity growth, or when we have high productivity growth, the economy can grow more quickly, and we tend to see lower inflation. And again, you can have wages grow without that inflationary impact. I'm a student of productivity, have gather data going back to 1889. And we've seen since then these eras of productivity, 10 to 20-year periods of high and low productivity. And we had this period of high productivity. You can kind of see it in the blue line in the mid-1990s to mid-2000s. And then productivity has slowed substantially. And since 2005, we've had a period of very low productivity, including in particular in the 2010s. In the recent period, we've seen a pickup. You can kind of see this in these orange bars. And the question is this a structural pickup or is this cyclical? Because as I mentioned, talking about the SOM rule, kind of recent trends are much harder to discern around the COVID period. So if it's structural, then the economy can grow faster. Then the impact of potentially that stringent immigration will be felt, policies will be felt less. It will still be felt, but you'll likely won't see as much of, you won't see, without it, you'd see, with the stringent policies, you'd see very tepid, without high productivity, we'll see very tepid growth. And in particular, after you get stringent immigration policies. So this could allow, with those policies, without productivity, Scott Bessent will not get his 3-3-3 economy. I can assure you. If we have strong productivity, then we potentially could get at least the first of the 2 3s, and strong economic growth is helpful to the budget deficit. So you could potentially get the second 3. Finally, and I'll stop here, just want to mention our American Growth Project. As I indicated, we're releasing our 2025 estimates for the 150 extended metro areas that we study. These 150 EMAs, as we call them, represent almost 90% of the US economy. And we are measuring and forecasting economic growth for all 150. What we anticipate that all of them are expected to slow in 2025, but all of them are still expected to grow. One of the interesting things pointing to North Carolina is you can see a lot of variation, but we have one of the largest numbers of extended metro areas, and you can see a lot of variation within the state, with the Triangle area as one of the strongest, the 4th strongest growth expected in 2025. Charlotte is number 12 in 2025, but we also have areas of weaker growth. Hickory is actually one of the weakest of the 150. So lots of interesting variation. We encourage you to look at our American Growth Project research. We'll be putting out a more detailed report about these areas, and you can look at the data after it's updated in late January, early February. So let me stop there. It went longer than I anticipated. I apologize. I see some questions, and we can open it up to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Gerald. And of course, it takes a little time to basically plot out all of 2025 for people. So I think that's okay to run a little bit long. And certainly a good headline there toward the end, that we do expect growth in all 150 of our EMAs, maybe slower growth, but all on the positive side. So something for folks to think about. We do have room for a couple of questions, and I think now that everybody has heard a little bit about the 5 trends, they may have some questions to ask. So if you want to do those, you can do that using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're with us by phone today, you can email them to me, rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. To the questions. Christian Kenneth says, are you able to comment on the change rate of government jobs in your page 2 visual? I would suggest this be a good distinction to show going forward.
So in fact, if I can move quickly through my slides, I can. So government tends to be kind of a less cyclical driver of, there we go. Sorry, I went too quickly. Tends to be kind of a less cyclical job creator. Although actually during the global financial crisis, we saw that state and local governments, because they're constrained by having balanced budgets, cut a lot of jobs, and were actually and then a bit of that occurred in the COVID period. But because because the federal government learned the lesson, that lesson, it was able to push more government to the states. But what you can see in this chart is that the government has been one of the key drivers of job creation over the last year. So this chart effectively breaks down job creation into, three parts. The largest being healthcare, and that's both structural and cyclical. So because structurally we're just healthcare is a larger part of our economy. Again, think demographics. Um, and then cyclically, because it's harder, the healthcare system after COVID, it was, a lot of people were leaving jobs. And so now, as you're seeing some loosening up of the labor market and kind of easing up of, kind of COVID has become less challenging to the healthcare system, we're hiring that back. By the way, my daughter is about to graduate nursing school, so she's going to be one of those healthcare jobs. Um, and then leisure and hospitality is also kind of more of a cyclical story because all those job losses around COVID, and then government. And so government is becoming an increasing share of the job creation. As I said, it's stickier than normal, but it's something that, and again, a key question is what's going to happen because of policies. Are you going to see big cuts in government jobs, and is that going to lead to slower, job creation and slower economic growth? So great question.
Okay, very good. On to the next one. What do you anticipate the impact to be on small business?
So, I mean, there's lots of things that are to talk about in small business. One is, its importance in the economy. Basically 50% of the economy is small business. And actually, I could tell you, when I was at Treasury, I did an analysis of this, and we know very little about small business because it's harder to measure activity going on in, small businesses. But they also, because there's just so many of them, and it's really hard to kind of survey that data. There are really kind of two types of small businesses, though, when we think about the economy. There's a lot of like small businesses that will remain small. Think about, mom and pop businesses on Main Street. And then there are the small businesses that we think about as the unicorns, small businesses that then grow to large businesses. And so when you're talking about small business dynamics, you really kind of want to talk about those two things. And then when you're thinking about it and you want to think about, what type of workers are being employed in those small businesses. So small businesses that are in construction potentially could be very challenging given immigration policies, same in leisure and hospitality. I mean, I could tell there. I looked at this data. 43% of construction workers are of Hispanic descent. 30% of leisure and hospitality workers are of Hispanic descent. I'm not saying that's just what we know about. We don't know if how many are immigrants, how many are not. The data, challenging of measuring people, measuring recent immigrants, and then the question is of their questionable people's what their legal status is. But we know that in those areas, immigrants play a very important role. And so that is one of the risks. But then, and one of the positives is, potential positives is, lower taxation, lax or regulatory policies. There's a push and pull. And one question about lower taxation for me is how does that affect our long-term debt dynamics? So are we lowering taxes and lowering spending? And by the way, if you lower spending, the key things are not to cut, the education department. It's if you really want to cut spending over the long term, you have to think about Social Security and Medicare. Those are and healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid. And those are the things that nobody wants to touch. So I just want to say that's if you want to if you really want to cut spending, that's where you need to discuss. I realized you asked a question about small business, and I went I went somewhere else, but that's the just want to tell you about what when you think about tax cuts, think about not just the tax cuts, but the implications on our debt. So sorry, Rob.
Nope, that's fine. New year, same issues sometimes. Uh,
Exactly.
here's an interesting question. Any feedback you might have about how these trends will impact philanthropy?
That's a good question. My wife is in the philanthropy world. I wish I could call her in and get her opinion on this. I think one question, a key question is growth. If you think about people are more philanthropic when the economy is growing, when they feel, wealthier, equity gains. And so this is an easy way for me to pivot to productivity. So, if we're in an environment where we have strong productivity growth, I would imagine that would be beneficial to philanthropy. The flip side is if you have tax cuts, as much as we all like to believe that people are philanthropic only, just for the right reasons, and I think people generally are. Or people are, but there is research to show that our tax laws affect the level of philanthropy. So the fact that we have a deduction for a charitable deduction impacts people's philanthropic behavior. And so if you cut taxes, effectively lowering the charitable deduction benefit, you could actually see some lower, less philanthropy. So there's a little bit of a yin and a yang.
Okay. This kind of goes back to a story that we talked a lot about a few briefings ago. How much do you think Helene will reduce NC's growth in 2025? Estimated economic impact almost $60 billion.
So very good question. I haven't put a number to it. We've actually been doing some work on the impact of Helene on the economy and, measuring it. That work is still in progress. So I don't have a good number, but you can see in the data a significant impact. I mean, we're looking at measuring, traffic data. We're looking at store openings and closings, and you're seeing, you're seeing the impact of Helene and, a number of stores that were closed, how much tourist traffic, how much spending traffic you're seeing. I will say one of the challenges when you're talking about these numbers is that as crazy as this sounds, is that if after a storm, you actually tend to have very strong growth once the recovery has begun, or as you're seeing the recovery happen. So assuming that a lot of the places are going to be rebuilt, and that's a strong assumption, but assuming that happens, you could actually see stronger growth in 2025 or 2026 than you would imagine. Now, people might take that to the extreme, saying, well, why don't we knock a building down in New York City or anywhere and then rebuild it because the economy is going to be stronger. But the fact is that the loss of that building and the loss of wealth, and as we've seen, the horrific impact of the storm is greater than the gain from building, but because you're contrasting two things: wealth, which is not economic growth, and GDP. So you're rebuilding. So you'll see a boom in GDP as you see the rebuilding, but that doesn't offset the loss in wealth from the storm. So it's a weird thing to talk about. But I would suspect in late 2025 and in 2026, you actually could see some very strong growth in those areas. And that's something that we're monitoring quite closely.
Okay. And Gerald, you might check me on this. I'm not sure if you're still sharing your screen or not. Zoom's thrown me some curveballs today, so I'm not sure what I'm looking at.
I am. I could stop sharing. Is that
Yeah, if we're off that if
okay?
we're off that topic. But
Okay.
I think we're down to our last question. I think this one seems like a good one to finish things off with. So the question is, what's the number one? So no top five here. This is number one. What's the number one economic indicator that you're watching in 2025?
Oof. That is a really hard one. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
in some respects, I'm going to say job creation, because, that's the key. If we continue to have job growth the way we do, I mean, that we've seen, then it's hard to imagine that the economy is going to look bad. If we start to see a meaningful slowdown, then I would worry. And, as much, and so I think in some respects maybe it's a great advertisement for coming back each month to see our economic briefing. And I promise you, I didn't say that for that. I'm just telling you, in some respects, it's really jobs, jobs, and jobs, and then a little bit of productivity.
You read my mind there. Yes, an excellent reason to keep coming back at 9 o'clock the first Friday of each month to see what we've got going on here. Thank you very much, Gerald Cohen, for talking about a lot of things today, including what to expect in 2025. It's become a little bit of a tradition around here for the January briefing, and it's always very interesting. Before I forget about it, let me also remind people that Gerald has written a piece on the 5 trends that is up on our website now. You can find it if you go to the landing page, kenaninstitute.unc.edu.
Sorry,
Mhm.
I don't want to interrupt you, Rob. When you're done, I do want to thank our team, in the research initiatives team, for all their hard work in putting these presentations. I get to stand here and show you beautiful charts, but it's really because of my colleagues, and good, hopefully good analysis, and it's because of all the colleagues in research initiatives. Cody Morris, who's behind the camera today. Juan Leon, who's behind the camera other months, some of these cool dynamic charts are because of her. Charlie Liu, and the entire team, and also a little shout out to my mom who's watching today.
Oh, special occasion. Very nice.
Yeah.
Terrific. Good point. And also thanks to Corey Powell, who pushes the Zoom buttons for us and is very much appreciated. All right. From here, let me say for the folks in the media, we'd love to continue the conversation. If you'd like to talk to Dr. Cohen about any or all of his 5 trends for 2025, you can reach out to me at rob_knapp at Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu, and we can make that happen. For all of you watching today, we do invite you to go to our website. Like I said, the 5 trends pieces are up there. There's going to be much more coming. We've got a grand challenge for 2025 that we'll be talking much more about very soon this month. So a good place to check. That is kenaninstitute.unc.edu. I think that is everything for today. 1 down, 11 to go for 2025. We appreciate you all being here. We look forward to seeing you February 7th, I believe. Check me on that, but we'll be sure to let you know when the next briefing is coming. Thanks again for being with us, and enjoy your Friday.